Oliver Norgrove is here.
Good morning, James.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well indeed, and very glad to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Thank you
you're
also
very
for
welcome.
being what I can only describe as peculiarly nice about me over the last few years.
Well, no, it's my pleasure, because contrary to what some people are determined to hear, not everybody who voted to leave was either racist or stupid or both, and you were more than that. You were a staffer in the Vote Leave office. So let's just begin with what you hoped would be happening now.
I hoped that Brexit would have gone much more smoothly and simply. There was a time where I felt that we were best kind of out of the single market, and I felt that, unfortunately, I have to admit that at one point I thought that we would be able to strike one of the easiest trade deals in history. I now realise that to be kind of fanciful.
Why did you think that? I'm not here to haul you over the coals. I'm fascinated by how a very intelligent person. I read your blog, so you'll allow me to say that. And my cleverest friend, as I may have told you on Twitter, I can't remember, who is related to a very prominent parliamentary Eurosceptic, probably the godfather of Euroscepticism. My cleverest friend voted Leave as well, so I suspect you might be coming from a similar place. But
so I thought it because one of the reasons why I thought it was because I just didn't know enough. I was just kind of ignorant, and I was getting messaging which I thought made sense. So if you take a look at some of the arguments that were put forward kind of a few years ago now, one of the ones you hate the most, which is the German car industry one.
Yes.
If you're somebody
so
that
you say I hate it. I believed it as well in a way.
But this is the kind of point here, which is that if you hear that for the first time and you haven't spent years thinking about trade and Brexit and how things will turn out, if you hear somebody say the German car industry will need they need us more than we need them because so many of their industry relies on exports to us.
Persuasive.
It sort of makes sense.
Yes.
It does kind of make sense. And I was hearing more and more arguments like this, which I felt meant that we could leave in a way which wasn't actually kind of economically damaging. But now I realise that, and what we've seen from negotiations, I think, is that the EU has shown quite an extraordinary commitment to its own territorial integrity and market integrity, and now we see why the EU has kind of erected such a stringent regime of third country controls against members who, well, not necessarily leave because no one's left before, but against third countries. And I just didn't know enough to really process that.
That's
before.
a really interesting answer, because when Jacob Rees-Mogg was sitting in that chair, actually he wasn't sitting in that chair, he was on that screen behind you, but he used the phrase protectionist racket. And that is the same, that's the other side of the coin that you've just described, perhaps, is that you could say, well, I didn't realise what an astonishingly good job the European Union had done in protecting its own industry and its own manufacturers. And he would say it's a protectionist racket, and you're both right.
We're both right. The EU is protectionist because it has to be protectionist, but you can say that about any major power.
Well, what do you want a power to do to its people? Protect them or not protect them?
Protect them. You don't just see it through the customs union, you see it through the common agricultural policy too, but major powers have to be kind of protectionist to an extent, because they've built something worth keeping is basically the idea. If you build something worth keeping, you put a fence around it.
Yes.
And it's such an age-old kind of principle, and it still applies today, of course. So I think that's really one of the things which I've sort of realised in recent months and the last couple of years. My own view, really, for me, Brexit fell on the Irish border.
Yes.
One of my major personal failings over the past few years, I'm definitely disappointed and slightly ashamed to kind of talk about this, but one of my personal failings over the past few years was that I simply didn't pay enough attention to the Irish border and the Northern Ireland issue, and that's largely my fault. I should have read more. I should have looked further into it and not been so kind of gullible. But also, I think I would like to slightly outsource blame a little bit, because I think that in general, if you look at British political discourse, I don't think we actually care enough about Northern Ireland in general. And I'm not trying to kind of absolve myself of responsibility in any way, but I think that if you look, say for instance, if you go back to New Year's 2013, where you had the riots in Belfast, there was no coverage in the UK. If you look at Northern Ireland now, Northern Ireland has some of the worst poverty in the UK, and it's never ever discussed. So I think we have this very weird thing in the UK where we sort of treat Northern Ireland as an unwanted son, and that has kind of filtered into the Brexit debate itself. And I think it's really weird, because when I was an activist, nobody ever spoke about Northern Ireland.
Well, John Major and Tony Blair did.
Yeah, they did, yeah.
So give us an idea of what it was like. I'm going to use the word bunker. I hope you don't find that unpleasant.
No.
But in the bunker, when two politicians of very different hues. Both came out and described what was going to happen in Ireland. And indeed, we found tape of Theresa May doing the same, although it didn't get the coverage that Blair and Major did. In the bunker, how did you dismiss that? How did that get poo-pooed
so I think
effectively?
Yeah. So I think what we did was we essentially took so they had that event in Belfast where they said, look, leaving the EU might undermine the peace process.
Will
undermine the peace process, because border infrastructure will, of course, undermine the objectives of the Good Friday Agreement. But basically, what we said was that, look, this is all kind of Project Fear. Don't worry about it. And it really tied in well because it came at a similar sort of time where Obama came over, and there was a lot of anti-elitist sentiment, and a lot of our messaging revolved around this idea that we were better than this, and that there wouldn't be as much damage on leaving as some people were perhaps saying.
Right.
So it tied in really kind of easily. And
so
it became
in fact,
very easy to dismiss.
The question you were asking yourselves at Vote Leave would be not, is this true, but how do we diffuse this?
It was how do we diffuse this, and we diffused it by simply going by Project Fear. And I have to point out that I know so many people across all kind of Leave camps, and there are so many different camps around.
Exactly.
But and one of the interesting things is that nobody really paid any attention to the Northern Ireland issue, which is really weird because it's now literally the centrepiece of what it becomes Brexit policy. You're not a Leaver. You're not a Leaver.
True.
No, maybe, I was listening earlier on. Apparently, you were at one point. So I was very proud of you. Actually,
some of us.
It's okay. We can all change our minds, James. Don't worry
about
it.
No, you're not wrong.
But it just wasn't discussed. I mean, I remember times where there was a time.
And why would you discuss it? It doesn't even sound big until it is big.
The thing about it is that it's true to say that the Irish border as an issue is not very politically sellable. To say like it doesn't really hit people when you actually say it in terms of your messaging in a hotly contested referendum campaign. And I think that was one of the kind of disadvantages that afflicted so much of Remain messaging. It just doesn't hit people very much. And I think
because it's not exciting or sensational or frightening.
Well, it's not, because you have to delve into customs and you have to delve into rules of origin, and you have to explain to people, look,
detail.
Exactly, and to some extent, you mentioned detail. To some extent, the Leave Remain divide is in some ways a clash of thought processes as well, and that's one of the kind of interesting dimensions to it. But you have to explain to people that actually, if you leave the customs union, then you need border infrastructure to deal with rules of origin checks. And of course, that in a referendum campaign, that's just not very. It's very kind of dry, and it's very hard to make those points.
Some nice compliments coming in, including one from the Scottish MP Stuart MacDonald, complimenting you on the quality of your contribution. You just said something fascinating to me in the break, and I'm going to repeat it on air. You just said this is only the second media you've ever done, and I said why, and you said
second radio,
sure, and you said because I'm not extreme enough, and oddly, even after all these months and years of picking over the carcass of Brexit for a living as I do, I just felt a penny drop.
Well, the thing is that I'm not someone who's obsessed or motivated by publicity. I take it where it is, and
sure,
I'm grateful that I have the following that I have, but I think that I have not been afforded the same kind of platform as a lot of more extreme figures who simply know less than I do. And I'm talking about people like Tim Martin, the Wetherspoons man.
Yes.
I'm not trying to sound vain or anything, but I feel like I have a reasonable level of knowledge, and I'm reasonably able to discuss and articulate some of the concepts involved in Brexit. And I think that there have been people like me, and there are other people like Roland Smith and Ben Kelly, who are other kind of, I guess you could call them Brexit commentators, and who've been kind of sidelined. And there are lots of soft leavers who've been sidelined in the process because they simply haven't been easily accommodated into this whole idea that the media needs to kind of portray the extremes of Brexit all the time, and and afford so much broadcast time and radio time and airtime to people who are literally achieving nothing apart from further poisoning and polarising the debate.
Is there anyone left in that camp?
There are a couple of people left in the camp. They're not very pleasant. I'd rather not mention them by name.
No, I didn't mean that. I meant the people who we would describe as pleasant.
I'm rather a fan of...
Because the two examples you just gave, they've both changed their minds as well, in different ways.
Recently and Roland quite a long time ago. I'm rather a fan of Henry Newman, who works at the I can't remember the name of the think tank.
European think tank.
Open Europe. I think he's very knowledgeable, and he would be worth talking to about these things. I think he's a supporter of the May deal, but in terms of anyone who's anywhere near the public domain, the only people who kind of crowd out the public sphere as far as Brexit discussion are people with very extreme views.
Do you know, again, I felt a penny drop. I have a little catchphrase, Oliver, that it's a lot easier to sell tickets for the ghost train than it is for the speak your weight machine. But I've always used that as part of the binary divide. I've always somewhat arrogantly seen people...
What does it mean, sorry?
Well, the speak your weight machine gives you an uncomfortable truth.
Oh, right, okay.
The ghost train frightens you with things that aren't real.
Mm-hmm.
I've always seen that rather arrogantly as a Leave-Remain divide, but you've essentially cast yourself as somebody who sells tickets for the Speak Your Weight machine from the Leave side, and that's not as exciting as the people selling tickets for the ghost train, like your Tim Martins or your...
I think that the working at Vote Leave had a real kind of impact on me, but I only really felt it in the sort of year or two afterwards. I feel that going forward, I don't want to be a politician or a journalist. I don't think I'd be very good at either, but I want to be.
Well, you don't have to be.
We've
not learned anything from the last 3 years.
Well, we have not good enough
secretary,
anyway.
Mate, by being a rubbish journalist and a rubbish politician.
But I've always been kind of adamant that the way that we go about fixing politics is to just be more honest. And I think there needs to be more self-awareness for one, and more honesty. And these are the two ingredients I think we're kind of sorely lacking at the moment. We can talk about constitutional crises, and I know you wanted to mention the Burko thing today, but
not necessarily.
I think that we need to just be more honest and have a little more self-awareness. And I think that I'll say this much: I'll say that I'm thankful that I'm not a bigger deal than I am. I'm thankful that I'm actually quite a small fish in the pond.
Because if you were a bigger deal, you'd
I'd
have
feel
found
more
it.
Guilty.
Would you have found it harder to climb down? Would you have climbed down at all?
If I had the same personality, yes, because I care about that stuff.
This is obviously why we're quite simpatico with each other, because I'm pretty sure that if I'd gone the other way, I would now be saying sorry.
I think you would too.
But no one is.
No one is, no. And it's very hard. A lot of what we've seen has been... and I made this point on the Romaniacs podcast recently, which was that over the years what we've seen, I think, is a slow radicalisation of Leavers, and a lot of Leavers have doubled down on erroneous beliefs. Like, for instance, you mentioned a couple of weeks ago the GATT Article 24 meme, one of my least favourite idea. The idea that we can have a
10 years doing whatever we want, and they'll just have to suck it up.
It's just such fanciful rubbish that one doesn't know where to begin. And
yet the people making those absurd claims will be in the studios every day, while people like you with your Speak Your Weight machine tickets,
and people who actually know how to rebut it don't get anywhere near the kind of anywhere near the time that they deserve to be able to rebut these kind of things. And I think it's an area where I think the media can take a little more blame, and I'm not trying to outsource kind of responsibility for all of this, but I think the media can take some blame for this.
Well, you're embedded in it and have described the powers of persuasion, simply having things presented to you relatively unchallenged about the German car industry or what it might be. So for somebody who's not doing this for academic reasons or for a living, or someone who's not, I mean, I have nothing but sympathy. I can even look, as I presume you can, at these poor souls marching around Yorkshire today, utterly abandoned by the people who charge them 50 quid for the privilege. I feel nothing but sympathy for those people, even though they would probably have me on a dartboard in the context of Brexit discussions. That to me is where the divide has gone now.
Why do you feel sympathy for them?
Because I think that they are victims of a con rather than perpetrators of a con, and they still haven't opened the box and accepted that there was nothing in it all along. And so my anger is reserved for the people who told them that the box was full of riches.
You don't think they helped to also further propagate it?
You'd have to speak to them individually.
I have spoken to lots of them individually, and I get that impression as well. I have less sympathy for them than perhaps you do.
Which
is very weird considering who you are.
Well, it is weird, but maybe you know them better than I do. So
I know some of them better than you do. I think
the type we're discussing, aren't we? Not the specific individuals.
Because remember, I used to be in UKIP about 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't like to talk about it because I'm kind of
So
I'd rather it didn't happen. But.
No, okay, but again, you just leave me and many other people listening wondering why you find it so easy to disavow this stuff publicly, and hardly anyone else, if anyone else, does. So
I care about intellectual honesty. I've always cared about it. I've cared about it ever since I started set up my blog a few years ago and tried to be someone who could articulate some of the issues as best as I could, and I think I managed it to some extent. I'm not an expert on so many things. I'm not really an expert on any of it.
Well, that's the first admission, isn't it? And that's the first step towards actually being properly informed and a degree of objectivity. So when did the needle start to move, Oliver? Not definitively, but just the very beginnings of the needle moving, because people were very, very embedded and entrenched in the immediate aftermath.
So for me, the needle began to move around about last summer. That was when I first considered kind of abandoning the Leave position, and there were a couple of things there were a couple of factors which led to it. So the first was I slowly realised that we would eventually need to retain a comprehensive customs union, and at that time I was an advocate of EFTA membership, and one of the things which isn't being properly communicated is that if you retain a comprehensive customs union, you can't actually accede to EFTA, because in order to accede to EFTA, you have to adopt EFTA's free trade agreements, and there are tariff conflicts there between the customs union and the FTAs. So if you retain a comprehensive customs union, you cannot join EFTA. And once I realised that, I felt, I in my mind, I knew that I had to acknowledge that if we're going to leave, the only way of leaving really sensibly is to take the single market and the customs union with us. But that causes a problem in the minds of soft leavers, and I'm not the only one as well. The customs union, when you throw the customs union in as well as the single market, it was really the kind of the Achilles heel of soft leavers, because what it does is it undermines the argument that Brexit is democratic, because what you're effectively forced to say to people is that we should keep the institutions but drop the say we have in them. And that really undermines the argument that you have that actually the EU isn't very democratic, which I think has merit, and I still do think has merit. So the remaining argument that we had, the whole democratic argument against the EU, and the reason why I voted to leave, was seriously undermined by the fact that we would need to keep those two major institutions, the single market and the customs union, but drop the say in them. And there was a clash in my mind there. The other reason.
So just to clarify, so you the European Union is nowhere near as democratic as it could be, but this mode of leaving would actually be even less democratic.
That would be exactly my view, yeah.
So it's the lesser of two evils, or the greater of two evils, as opposed again to black versus white,
that's correct.
yay versus nay.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think if any objective, sensible person really thinks about these issues, then you have to. Sorry, I don't mean to patronise, but
no, you sound like me now.
you have to just say, look, there's no perfection either way. There's no ideal pathway. But the other reason why the needle started to move for me was that I realised increasingly that I was surrounded by people who were just lying, and I felt that I was part of a systemic sort of deliberate and desperate campaign of political lying. The GATT meme I mentioned already. There was the argument that the WTO's trade facilitation agreement would render border friction illegal under a no-deal scenario, and I felt that I was surrounded by people who just weren't telling the truth. And
so you saw where the mission had led. You saw these bald untruths, and then you traced back from there and perhaps recognised that some of the stuff you hadn't realised were untruths because they weren't quite as bald. You'd also been part of promoting.
And it kind of worried me and it frightened me a little bit. So
conscience level stuff.
Yeah. So I just thought, you know what? I'm surrounded by people who are just lying and aren't telling the truth, and I just felt this isn't necessarily a club that I really want to be a part of anymore.
And how did it feel when you resigned your membership? Were you allowed to retain all the benefits of membership?
You know, one thing I will say is that I was expecting a lot of abuse from Remainers, but I was met with an enormous and shocking level of humility, and I was quite surprised by that, because I thought that Remainers would kind of hate me for being a part of it in general, especially because I was a slightly bigger part of it than the average voter.
Sure.
But I was met with quite a lot of humility, and I was quite impressed by that, I have to say.
So it should be. Oliver Norgrove, it's been a pleasure. Do you want to hear some of the reaction to your
oh, please, yeah.
contribution? This is from Deirdre. Well done, Oliver Norgrove. Any chance you could go for Prime Minister?
I don't want to be a politician.
More chance of him presenting mystery out. Bravo, Oliver Norgrove.
Thank you very much.
Sensible, honest stuff. Integrity is tearing its hair out. If you and then a nice plug from Wiz for the radio show. And this from Scott Balcony over in Oxbridge. Bless him for laughing at your ghost train analogy and then asking what it meant. Hashtag Je suis Norgrove. It's been a pleasure. Where can people read your blog?
Thank you.
Where's the blog? Give us a quick link.
It's just norgroveblog.co.uk, but thank you very much.
No, my pleasure entirely.